fascinating conversation for you, and one that hopefully will really help empower you as we as a community, as business owners, as employees, wend our way through the changing marijuana laws. You know, we were joking at the beginning before we started the official part. Can you walk down the street smoking? Well, we'll see. I'm Benita Zahn. I'm very happy to be hosting this for you, and let me introduce our guests. We've got Michelle Payan. Michelle is the owner of Commercial Investigations, LLC. She founded the agency in 2004 and has grown the business with a proactive approach by setting new standards in background investigations in that industry. As president, she's responsible for the strategic direction, which assists our multi-industry client base. Michelle's expertise and experience provide CI's clients with the best possible services available. And right now, I'm sure you've got a backlog of folks who want to pick your brain as we wend our way through the marijuana changes in the workplace. Also with us is Joan Marie Dowling. Joan Marie is the founder and managing member of Dowling Law, a certified woman-owned business, and Clarity HR Solutions. Good to have you with us. Dowling Law provides strategic employment law advice and representation to organizations throughout New York State. Dowling Law also provides premier affirmative action compliance and pay equity services and in-person online workplace training solutions. Clarity HR Solutions supports employers to develop strong employee relations strategies and efficient HR practices. The two of you are in great demand now. And then we round out our panel with the Ulster County Sheriff Juan Figueroa. I check beforehand, and then I get to the taping, and I get hung up. Sheriff Figueroa has always been moved by a sense of service to people in his community and country. He joined the Marine Corps straight out of Wallkill Senior High. After active duty with the Marines for 4 years, Juan served 18 years with the Marine Corps Reserve. He became a trooper with the New York State Police in 1988. Patrolling the roads in Ulster County, and during his 25-year career with the state police, he assumed key leadership roles, initially as a police academy instructor and field training officer, then as an investigator with the Bureau of Criminal Investigation, BCI, as it's known, for 19 years. And then Juan worked on several long-term investigations involving money laundering, narcotics, and drug cartels. I would like to ghostwrite your book. You're also very involved in the opioid, how to deal with and support those who have been wrapped up in the opioid epidemic. And, you know, we're going to take out any stigma in this conversation. That's what keeps people from seeking information. That's what keeps people from getting support and help. So this is a conversation of what and how. So let me go back to what I initially said. In New York State, can you walk down the street smoking? And the answer you gave to me is?
Yes. Actually, unless it's posted like non-smoking, you can. I mean, we're not gonna, you know, times have changed. I mean, it's quite the adjustment for us in law enforcement to deal with this, even though those of us that have been dealing with narcotics investigations know that marijuana was never a prime target of any of our investigations. But still, it's an adjustment for someone who, by the way, thanks for making me feel so old, but yes, someone who's from a different generation, really. Mm-hmm. And it's a sea change on top of everything else, bail reform, discovery, when it comes to the law enforcement community.
And that sea change plays into the employer perspective as well. One, employers have to really catch up to what is and isn't legal. Two, there's still, the ground underneath is still changing. And three, it's one thing if you've got an employee who's smoking Camels and takes their cigarette break. But what if you have an employee who's smoking something from the dispensary or even homegrown. And I want to talk about that too, because there was just an arrest of somebody. A drone did a flyover and saw that somebody was growing, and then they were arrested. So I'm going to use the word squishy in terms of legal and not. So what does the employer do? Do you have a smoking area for everybody who smokes?
I'm not sure. That's really a good question.
Yeah.
And that's why we've gathered today. It's like, what do employers do? What do employees do?
Yeah.
Well, and the law is clear in one point. It's maybe not clear at any other point, but it's clear that employers are not mandated to allow on-site use of cannabis.
But let me stop you. What if it is medical marijuana and somebody does an every 4 or 6 hour treatment with it?
Yeah, so the rules for medical marijuana are different insofar as it's an accommodation issue. However, I'm not aware of any requirement even in that circumstance, but there may be other adjustments that need to happen for the employee. So it's a fact-specific assessment that the employer would have to go through.
That makes me hear the 3 letters ADA.
Absolutely, and the New York human rights law is even more protective in some cases than the ADA.
We know that no employer wants an employee to show up drunk. And it's usually pretty obvious. Usually, not always, usually. And you can send somebody home, correct? Mm-hmm. But if they show up and you say, Jimmy or Jane doesn't seem quite with it, and their eyes look glassy, can you send them home? What do you do? This is really the meat of the issue.
Yeah, and the challenge really is that as much as law enforcement may struggle in terms of impairment, they have, I think, some experts that can help out in ways that the average employer can't. New York State Department of Labor issued some guidance. We don't have any regulations in this area yet, but guidance about what is a specific articulable symptom of impairment. That's the standard. And unfortunately, they didn't really give us any guidance in their guidance. They said a drug test is not sufficient, so we know that. We know that an odor of cannabis is not sufficient, that we are looking at impairment. But they don't really give us a whole lot of guidance on what that looks like and how much impairment we need to see before we can establish a defense that would allow the employer to take action against that employee.
And go ahead.
Federal law prohibits law enforcement or peace officers, if they're armed with ammunition and weapons, plus our own collective bargaining agreements, prohibit officers from using marijuana. And if they come in, it's kind of like a stepped procedure: glossy eyes, slurred speech, the smell of marijuana. Then we would send them to get a urinalysis. But that could be as well as the use of opioids. So I think our guidelines are a little bit different than most. We do have civilians, though, that work in our office, and if they're in sensitive situations or because they have access to certain information, then yeah, I mean, we're still trying to figure out the guidelines on how to move forward. I believe there's probably going to be some lawsuits or some collective bargaining agreement issues regarding the use of marijuana or cannabis.
We still have the issue of the feds say it's not legal.
That's right. The federal government says it's not legal. That's right.
I know New York's Legislative Commission on Rural Resources has asked the Office of Cannabis Management, that's the biggie, Cannabis Management, for clarification and updates on the state's rollout of the legal marijuana industry. So how do you start following this as an employer, to due diligence even on an employee?
I'm not really sure. It's hard. It's very subjective, and that's hard, because you have large organizations with large human resource departments, and what's subjective to one person will differ between the HR people even. So looking for a more objective way to take care of these issues.
What do you tell HR people right now?
Stay tuned. New York State Department of Labor hopefully will issue some regulations. There is a THC breathalyzer coming out, maybe next quarter or this quarter. We're in fourth quarter, or first quarter next year. So there's a THC breathalyzer. So it's questionable under the guidance Joe Marie was talking about if that constitutes a test.
Which you just said isn't legal.
Right. So interestingly, the statute doesn't talk about whether you can or can't test an employee for cannabis. Interestingly, New York State Department of Labor said you can't, definitively, in their guidance. They didn't explain the basis for that conclusion. And I think part of it is probably that they're responding to the fact that a lot of tests right now that are available are testing for presence of various elements that could be in the system for quite some time. So it's not evidence of impairment, which is what employers are supposed to be worrying about, not whether someone has engaged in this on the off hours.
Yeah, right. You could have been engaging the night before and just be tired in the morning. And your employer says, come here, I want you to...
Yeah, like a urinalysis, that can be 3 or 5 days history of marijuana consumption. A hair test can be 90 days. You've got a blood test, which isn't as common, but that's in there too, maybe a week or so. So it's not directly related to the impairment that Joe Marie is talking about, but it's really like all they have, like Sheriff mentioned, you send them for a urinalysis because what else is there right now?
Impairment is a great topic, especially if you're driving a motor vehicle. That's our biggest fear in law enforcement, that folks are going to get behind the wheel when they're buzzed, and it's going to cause some major accidents. We have drug recognition experts. My office does not have one. However, there are 8 in the county, so we would have to reach out to the county, whether it's the state police or another agency, to come in and do that drug recognition test. And of course, impairment. The same type of you have to build your story up in order to arrest. You have to have your facts together.
Let me jump in. So .08 is you're drunk. So what's going to be buzzed? How do we determine that? Maybe can you come to work and you had one cocktail just to get you chill enough to walk through the door? And I'm sure there are many people who have a little something in the morning before they go to work. I wouldn't even want to hazard a guess.
We're hoping that there's going to be a side road type of test in the near future regarding the use of marijuana when you're driving behind the wheel. You still can't go down the road smoking a joint while you're driving or having a beer in your hand as an open container. The degrees of impairment will be determined by that drug recognition expert, and another program is called A-RIDE that most of law enforcement attends, but really it's the and it's the same thing that you see with a DWI. You have to, are they all over the road? Are they going over the double yellow line? Is their speech slurred? Are their eyes red? When you ask them a question, are they coherent? And that's how you determine your impairment. It's not going to be easy, and that's the biggest fear for law enforcement is how do we convict folks that are going to continue to do this and get into accidents. I also believe, though, that society has changed. When someone is drinking now, you have Uber. There's so many different ways that you can get from point A to point B. It'd be ridiculous and dumb to get behind the wheel if you're smoking marijuana or even drinking beer. So, 20, 30 years ago, nobody put their seatbelts on. Well, people put their seatbelts on now. So we're hoping that there's some common sense out there when it comes to getting behind the wheel of a vehicle, or even when it comes to employers, heavy equipment, to know that they're impaired to use that equipment.
We still have people who get behind the wheel drunk.
We do.
And so let's...
It happens,
right.
Absolutely.
We're still going to have people who are going to drive buzzed.
Sure.
And you're still going to have employees show up buzzed. Doing background check, how do you see it changing with the laws around marijuana use changing? In terms of what can an employer actually ask and look for, and how far, where can they delve?
Sure. So the pre-employment drug testing, after the recreational marijuana law was passed, then the pre-employment drug testing, slowly our clients in New York State eliminated the panel for marijuana. So on a pre-employment basis, employers in New York State generally are not testing for marijuana anymore. There are still some exceptions, very, very few, involving federal contracts and deals with the federal government. Then, there's also, with the drug testing in the background investigations area, there's incident, and there's also random. So, of course, those have been taken out of random, but incident, it's still, it can be considered an incident, but the issue there is you can't tell impairment or how long it's been, because it can be in their system like 3 to 5 days. So there's still a, impairment generally is about a 3-hour window, and the THC breathalyzer would be able to test for that.
But again, nobody has set a standard on how buzzed is buzzed. Right?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's putting employers and employees, quite honestly, in a tremendously difficult situation. Unless we're going to be able to call the sheriff when we have suspicions, and maybe he can pull some strings and get us an expert, it's really, really difficult. I mean, what we often advise employers is look for impact on the work. Look for impact on safety. If someone's operating equipment, are they doing it in a safe way? If they are performing services, but they've slowed down significantly, they don't seem able to pay attention in meetings or those sorts of things, we're going to be addressing those issues primarily. And the reason for it then will necessarily have to come second, because in the grand scheme of things, because of a lack of any kind of clear, bright line or standard, it's really difficult for employers to use that as a particular basis.
So right now you're really at sea. So you're not testing, you're not screening for marijuana use, and employers are keeping their fingers crossed that employees don't come in too high. Is that really where we're at right now?
So we have, obviously, because we're law enforcement, every month we have surprise urinalysis just to see that our folks are not violating laws, and we don't want folks that are under the influence working for us. Whether we have what's called a 10-panel urinalysis, which includes marijuana, and that's something that that's always been the case in law enforcement, even in the military. After a holiday, there's a surprise urinalysis, and that is a quality assurance for us that the people that work for us are not engaged in the use of drugs because of the importance of the job.
But I think I'm hearing you can't do that.
Well, so there are certain times when you can.
You can,
right?
Yeah,
right, and that's the challenge. If it's required by law, then you can engage in that kind of testing.
It's a different type of work, though, too.
Yeah.
I mean,
no
what we
question.
do, we go out and deal with the public on a daily basis. And can you imagine if an intoxicated or an impaired trooper, a deputy showed up at somebody's house? How can we enforce the law when we ourselves aren't adhering to it? So, or intoxicated or impaired, it's just no one's going to be able to accomplish our missions. So having that is important for us.
Right. The challenge is, I was just going to say, the challenge, though, for employers is that some safety positions do have a statutory or a legal mandate for testing, even in the private sector. So, okay, we've got those safety positions, but those aren't the only safety positions that we have to worry about. And the way that this law is written, you really have to kind of catch it as it happens, because you can do a random test and somebody can test positive, but it's not evidence of impairment. New York State is saying that we can't even do it. If we see impairment some other time, we're going to have to really be, employers are going to have to be screening for it.
Joan Marie, why is it that law enforcement can do all this, but a health practice can't?
Simply because of the work that we do.
But don't you want your doctor not to be buzzed?
Absolutely, but we're in the front line of, we respond to some pretty, unique situations that most do not. We are trusting someone that went to the academy to drive a vehicle, go to the range, get all the training that's required from use of force, rules and regulations that each one of our agencies have in order to carry out. And of course, transparency, which is huge in today's world of law enforcement, in order to carry out the jobs that we have to do. It is much different. We're similar to the military, because the military does random exams too. We go to the range when we're in the military. We're sent all over the world. And to have someone impaired to carry out such an important role is extremely dangerous for the public.
Sure. Oh, no, not even a question.
Right.
Not even a question. You've got a loaded gun. Slam dunk.
Right.
But, so what I think I'm hearing, and if I am, then our folks who are listening to this, the world really has not changed for law enforcement, except you are now in the situation of how do you identify with a breathalyzer and who's going to determine what is impaired. But in terms of testing, that hasn't changed.
Has not.
Right. You may have.
And it's part of a collective bargaining agreement as well with the unions.
Right. But for the other employers, I'm hearing that right now there's no definitive set of rules and regs. That if I have a business and I want to make sure that, because we use heavy equipment, that nobody is buzzed, I can't test them. I can't do a urinalysis, correct?
Yeah, so you're going to look at each safety-sensitive position, and you're going to have to do an individual assessment. Those who are governed by DOT, so somebody who has their commercial driver's license, there are specific regulations that mandate testing, and if the state or federal government mandates testing, then under New York rules, you can test them. But you're going to have to do that analysis for each position that you have, essentially, looking at what the risk assessment. So for employers, the focus is, look at those safety positions very critically. And you're going to have to probably be working with a lawyer to make sure you know what what you can do and what you can't do. And then for everybody else, it's going to be looking at performance, looking at safety as we go along.
Yeah, but then you could say, my boss doesn't really like me, so they're making me.
Yeah.
Yeah, what about that?
Yeah, Joe Marie and I talked a little bit about productivity standards. So, we don't necessarily have we don't have safety sensitive positions. We're all in the office, we're all doing background investigations. But, how do you know if somebody's not performing due to marijuana? Well, you really don't know if it's marijuana or not, but you look at your positions and you talk about, productivity standards, and then so you have something objective so that the boss doesn't like me. Well, you were able to accomplish X, Y, and Z where the person next to you was accomplishing A, B, C, D, and E, and so in my mind, as a business owner, it puts more burden on the management to first create these levels of productivity standards for the positions, and then to start comparing people, and then to how do you want to drive the organization, and what message do you want to send, and is marijuana that much of an issue that you have the time and energy to go through all that too?
And then, let's go back to law enforcement. You find out that one of your employees has been pulled over for driving high. Let's just make the world that whatever the number is 2 on the breathalyzer for buzzedness, and one of your deputies pulls somebody over and finds that they blew a 3. Right. I'm just picking numbers.
Sure.
So where does
so again, we're a little bit different. For example, any interaction with law enforcement, if you get arrested, it's an automatic 30-day suspension in my office. Automatic 30 days. And then, of course, the county has its drug policy where they give you a second chance. You have to go either to a rehab, and the state police isn't like that, nor is the military. If you do something and it's in your system and it's proved, you're probably going to lose your job. But each county works differently. Each agency works differently. In our county, we would, ask, the county would probably ask the individual to go to a rehab. Maybe there's an issue there that we don't know about. We find out what's going on at home. We find out what led to this. Remember, law enforcement see things that most people don't, so they have a tougher job dealing with individuals, and some people can't handle what occurs, so they may go out and drink heavily, or divorce rate's extremely high in law enforcement. So we have to look at the background here too. If the person needs help, we're going to give them that help.
But does the world at large see the use of marijuana recreationally as disruptive to one's life as opioid use, or as even alcohol use? So, well, your rules are very clear. For an employer, do they now have to set a new set of rules that if you are impaired, we're going to recommend you go see a counselor, we're going to recommend drug counseling? Is that something that's even being considered? And is that, I'm seeing the look
I'm going to say time out on that one, because what we always have to be concerned with is a regarded as disabled claim. And under federal law, traditionally, an individual who was currently using illegal drugs, that was not protected as a disability. With changes in New York State, I think employers have to sort out. We don't want to, with one arrest, for example, draw the conclusion that someone has a drug addiction or has a record of one. So that's something that you always want to be careful about when you're making assessments. So that's always something to pay attention to, particularly in the context of alcohol. We've seen an individual might have a single incident of a DUI or DWI, and someone might leap to the conclusion that they have a substance use disorder. And there can be some particularly nasty legal consequences if the employer goes down that path. So they're looking at it different ways, but mostly allowing the employee to sort of self-identify. For pending arrest, there are particular processes that an employer can go through to kind of assess how they would manage, which is typically handled differently depending on the employer.
Are there some rules or guidelines, rules sound a little too, some guidelines that all employers at this junction should be putting into their protocol? Or is it still too early? Does everybody still have to sit back and go, well, we're still waiting for the Cannabis Commission to send us some more marching orders?
I know in our office, we implemented a marijuana policy with the help of our attorneys. And, so we do have a written policy about it. And I think a lot of employers have done that or are looking to do that. I think, you kind of have to address it because people are talking about it and it's out there. And, one of the things we get is, well, an employee came to us and said this other employee was in the restroom and walked out before them. And when they walked in, it really smelled like marijuana. So you have employees reporting other employees, and the employer feels like they've, what do you do? You got to kind of do something. Do you have a policy? What do you do? And
so should there be some new policies now, even in advance of more clarification? Does it behoove an employer now to do something?
I think that at a minimum, most organizations, if they haven't already, are looking at their drug testing policies and making those adjustments.
Which have to be backed off because you can't test for marijuana now.
Yeah, so taking marijuana out of the panel of specifically pre-employment and random testing if they're doing that. And then I think other organizations are thinking about, do they want to have an affirmative policy on marijuana? Are they going to do something within their existing policies? There are organizations that are governed by the Federal Drug-Free Workplace Act. Those are not necessarily inconsistent, But it's always good for employers, especially those in the HR function, to be familiar with their policies in the event that something happens.
What if in this changing world an employer says, I want to talk to Sheriff Figueroa, and I like what they're doing there. I want to draw my policy like his. And it's pretty clear.
Again, because of
that's
the
not legal,
legalities
though,
of
is
it,
it?
on a regular basis. However, the counties already had reasonable kind of suspicion guidelines if someone is
But counties
impaired.
for law enforcement or
Generally, each county, like I know our county has a policy. Somebody comes in intoxicated or someone is under any type of influence of drug, there's a reasonable cause policy. Again, it's building your evidence, if you will, leading to why the individual seems off, whether it's his productivity, whether it's something that occurred that he said or something, his actions. And so, yes, there's already policies. They're just inclusive now, more so because of the legalizing of cannabis.
or exclusive.
Sure.
Get the cannabis out of the plant. What legal hook can an employer be on if they're no longer testing for marijuana and one of their employees goes out and gets arrested by one of your deputies because they did something really bad behind the wheel of the car, and you're not testing for it, you're not breathalyzing, you're like, you know what, New York State says you can do it, just do it. What kind of legal hook is an employer on for what their employee does when they leave work? And is there a time frame?
I'm sure there's liabilities involved. If an individual is stopped or arrested, the next thing you know, you have that reasonable cause at work and something happens at work. You're talking about some major liabilities if someone is a heavy equipment operator, for example.
That leaves everybody sort of in this, I keep using that word, squishy, because if you can't test for it, how do you know? And if you didn't know, why should you be held accountable? And I'm sure employers are thinking that. And Joe Maria, I see the look on your face. That's when they call you. They go, Joe Maria, I got you on speed dial, you know.
Absolutely. I think that the challenge that employers face is this balance between complying with these new requirements, with the limitations on what proactive steps an employer can take to ensure that an employee isn't impaired.
So let me just stop so we can enumerate. The new requirement is you can't test.
Right.
That's the only change.
Right. Well, so that you can't test and you can't prohibit altogether. So we can't have an agreement with our employees that say you agree as a condition of working for Dowling Law that you will not engage in recreational use of marijuana. It's actually covered by the New York labor law as a lawful consumable product.
And if it's, so those are the two. I can't test and I can't ask.
Right.
I can't ask you not to. Can't test, can't ask you not to.
Right.
This has got to be clear for employers.
Right.
And if it's medical marijuana, you're still in the in-between, the nether world of making accommodations for them to use it.
Right. But again, they can't be reporting to work under the influence. So they can't be impaired even if it's medical marijuana. Of course, the challenge is if we need to have experts to help law enforcement figure out who's impaired and who's not, how is the employer or the employee supposed to really be able to make that assessment?
So now we move on to the breathalyzer. Are you getting a sense that employers, and there's a lot of questions here, and I'm sure the sheriff is going to get involved. Are you getting questions from employers as to when is it going to be available, what's it going to cost me, and how do I get to use it and do it?
Exactly. So it's very new. There's few unknowns yet. They test for parts per 1,000 in the breath. It's not sure if you're going to get a yes or a no, or you're actually going to get a reading as far as But it should be, if it's at a minimum a yes, it means that they are impaired within the last 3 hours. They have consumed marijuana containing THC and stuff. So then, so that's this breathalyzer unit, okay? So each breathalyzer unit has a cartridge, and each cartridge is rather costly. I mean, they're estimated in between $60 and $100 per cartridge. So, I've had employers say, well, can we just test everybody before they hop on the forklift? And it's like, well, you can, but it's expensive. So besides the cartridge, you've got the handheld unit, which is a few $1,000s, I believe, and then the individual has to blow into the unit for up to 2 minutes, for 2 minutes, not 2 minutes continuously, but over a period of 5-10 minutes, you got to blow and blow, so that it gets enough exhalation to make its determination. Then you have to take the cartridge out of the handheld and you have to put it in a unit that's maybe 18 inches by 18 inches. And then you have to wait 20 minutes for it to run the test. Okay, so are you going to have everybody? Are you going to be paying everybody for 20 minutes while you're waiting for the test to be run, even if you can't afford the test? That's a lot of time. So there's a lot of issues with it, and it's predicted the unit's going to be between $8,000 and $10,000 to have a unit. Now, the one unknown, because we looked into helping our employers out, especially the smaller employers, can we have some type of mobile unit or something that goes around and eventually tests the cartridges and stuff? And so not everybody needs this unit, and it's still unclear. We're still waiting for an answer. Like how soon after that cartridge is made should that be tested? So then after all that, if you get a positive from the unit, you can take action, different things like that, but you should also send it off to Quest Labs to confirm you're positive, okay? So it's a process.
By the time you get all that stuff done, the workday's over.
So, I'm sitting here thinking about
Yes.
that. And
So what do you do?
So the legality of, the evidence, because that's really evidence.
Yeah.
And it's like anything else. You have to build your story as to why the person is going to take that test. Just like, and of course, we in law enforcement would have that, but then we have to see if it's the courts are going to allow that. All the people that are using it are certified users of that equipment. And then who took the cartridge from point A to point B? Is there a record?
The
of it?
chain.
Absolutely. So on a legal aspect of it, obviously we would love to have that type of equipment, and I'm sure that which brings me back to the also the taxes that come out of the sale of cannabis. Where is that going to be used? Is that going to be utilized to buy tests like that for the purposes of law enforcement or employers in the future? And again, that's just one piece of building your story as to how you get them to take the breathalyzer to begin with. It's not just somebody walking in, get on the breathalyzer. Obviously, for law enforcement, that's different because of our collective bargaining agreement. But for any regular person, you have to build up as to, I'm sure, legally, whether you can do that.
And given all this, how are you going to do this roadside?
I'm sorry?
How are you going to administer a breathalyzer that takes all these steps? How will you do it roadside?
We do it right now with a regular breathalyzer.
But it doesn't take all this. It's not this many steps.
I suspect at some point they'll streamline that process for the purposes of law enforcement. Remember, it's got to go in front of courts.
Right.
Is the person that's given that exam certified to give the exam? So there's a whole process, which I'm sure on your side will have to be done as well.
Like the first iteration of computers.
Yeah, exactly.
You need a
Stay
whole
tuned.
room, right?
But then it's interesting because if you think about that kind of technology, we talked about the complying with the law, but the other piece is if you have somebody driving for you, even if they're only driving occasionally, if you have someone operating heavy equipment or doing something else that's safety sensitive, employers have to worry about negligence and a claim that they should have known this person was impaired. And that they should not have been in that position. And with technology becoming available, the question is, when would employers be expected to use something like that?
That's a good question. That really is, and where we are right now, you can't test the way you used to, and you can't ask, and your fingers are crossed that one of your employees who you haven't tested doesn't do something to bring your world crashing down. And I'm not one. I don't mean to set this up as an us and them, because it could be the employer who could be using and impaired and not making appropriate decisions for their employees.
Could be.
Where does that stand? Does an employee have any recourse if, to use your story, they leave the men's or ladies' room, and they go, whoa, the boss was in there right before me, and the marijuana odor, they must be high. What happens then?
I mean, we have a collective bargaining agreement with our unions, so there's certain guidelines, for example, the 10-panel test, and I think perhaps on the civilian side, that's going to be something that you're going to have to address, whether it's going to court, taking a union to court, or a member to court, or an employee to court. With the new law, you're going to see some folks testing it and taking it to court. And that's just part of the whole legal system when you have a new law.
You know, it's difficult to get employees right now across the board. And might this be a roadblock to employment in terms of attracting employees? So I can go and work for you because you don't require any testing, but Joan Marie is going to make me blow into that breathalyzer. So I don't want to do that.
We already have an issue in law enforcement that no one wants to be in law enforcement. We're having a hard time trying to get folks to become corrections officers and become. We're competing with the regular, industries out there, and times have changed.
Because I think in terms of a lie detector, there were companies that required, before you could be employed, to take a polygraph.
So that's illegal now. I don't
know
know when we're talking about then.
I had a lot of stories on that.
Yeah,
but I had made a decision and knew folks who said I would never work for somebody who wanted to polygraph me for myriad reasons. Not because you're going to be a liar, but that they immediately think you're going to be lying. Bad way to start Might that now happen with breathalyzers for THC?
Well, I know, 10 years ago, probably, I was working with a client and asked them about marijuana testing specifically, and they said, Joan Marie, if we tested for marijuana, we wouldn't have any employees left. And fortunately for all of us, there's attorney-client privilege. So I'll end the conversation there, except to say that I think organizations are already playing that calculus.
So then maybe nothing's going to change. Maybe you took it out. You took out the urinalysis, the testing for all but law enforcement, federal employees, because it's still illegal there. But nothing's going to change. Is that a potential also?
I think we may experience a little bit of that initially, but then there will be some settling down the road where people will find a middle ground, so to say, that can kind of help that liability you're talking about from the employer perspective, and protect everybody, because it's in the employee's best interest to protect the employer. If an employer gets stuck in a liability lawsuit, that's a lot of time and energy and resources put on that one lawsuit versus what's your product you're really trying to deliver.
Yeah.
So it's in everybody's best interest to avoid that.
I mean, I'm going to go down a rabbit hole here. Most employees don't care.
Yeah, because right now they can get a job anywhere.
Right. Mm-hmm. So the onus is really on employers, and the only thing that's changed is you cannot test now. So how does that change with a breathalyzer? If you can't do a urinalysis, if you can't ask when they come in pre-employment, why will an employer be allowed to use a breathalyzer?
As an employer, I think with the guidance that's out there now, like Joan Marie said, it's not regulation. And I think as technology evolves, hopefully the Department of Labor will take a look at things and decide, these guidance really provide for some very, very subjective measures that employers are put into. And here we have something, it could be a little bit down the road as this equipment evolves. Here we have something that can be much more objective. And perhaps we don't want to have guidance anymore that says you can't test, but says, now that things have evolved, the guidance will evolve and maybe we'll settle on some good regulation that involves what technologies happening right now with the testing.
But it's also potential that it won't.
Right.
I mean, you can't test, you can't ask. This is don't ask, don't test, is where we are right now.
Well, assuming that position stands the test of litigation, right? This right now, New York State is taking this position and its guidance, but it hasn't been tested. There's nothing in the statute that specifically prohibits employers from testing. I could go down a legal rabbit hole in terms of some parallels, but I'll spare everybody that. We'll save that for coffee later. But I think that to answer your question in terms of why would employees go or why would applicants go to an organization that was doing testing, assuming that it becomes available and it's accurate, I think actually employees. There's a good number of people who probably would want that testing. If you're operating heavy equipment and you've got somebody who's next to you and you're concerned about, how safe they are, there is some value to that and some benefit to that. And taking some of this subjectivity out of the process, because right now employers can still take action if somebody comes to work impaired. If there's an accurate test, then that does take out some of the subjectivity, which is actually protective of employees who are not coming to work impaired. So there is some value in that if that becomes available. I think a little bit of the challenge for all of us is the ship sailed, and we're still building the ship as we go along, and we're still trying to figure out where we're actually headed. So there's a lot, I think, that remains to be seen in terms of how this evolves.
And what if your business is on the border with Massachusetts or Vermont, and folks who live in those states have a different perspective because of the laws in their states? I know once you cross the border, but you're dealing with that too.
Mm-hmm. You are, and remote employees as well, because of course, a lot of folks with the pandemic said, this is great, we can hire anywhere. The challenge is that if you have an employee who is living and working in Massachusetts, Massachusetts law typically would apply. If they're in Vermont, Vermont law typically applies. In New York law typically applies. And so you're having to do that analysis of if there is an issue and when is somebody reporting to work in a remote location. But we have to sort those things out. It's not as easy as just somebody working, at their home computer.
So that's another area that has to be very clear. You may be living in Massachusetts, but it's in my house, my rules, which is where we are. But again, I keep coming back to it's hard to know what my rules are right now until New York State goes a little further. And the feds can still change.
There's another whole perspective when you talk about different states. We've seen it in California, in Colorado, and that is the illicit drug trade that will continue even after the legalization of cannabis. 2001, after what happened on September 11th, there was an influx of cigarettes that came from the South into New York, and they were just putting the state tax on there and selling them. This way they don't have to pay the state tax. And that was such a hard, it got so bad that New York State Tax had to put a detail together to go down and stop that, do undercover work to do that. If they're doing that with just tobacco, I could just imagine what's going to happen here in New York once the Cannabis Board puts all the rules in place regarding the illicit side of it. And 25 years in the state police, 19 of which was involved in a lot of narcotics cases. Out of all those years, if I had 2 marijuana cases, it was too much. But that wasn't the focus of law enforcement back then. But now it is going to be, because the state and the county is going to want their tax money when the illicit drug trade is selling more than the legal drug trade. And that's going to be an issue for law enforcement.
Right, and we have fluctuated. We talked a little before the official part was in the 70s, you had the Rockefeller drug laws, which were draconian. And people were being targeted, and they were going to jail for marijuana, a cigarette, a joint, for 1 or 2. I mean, it was, and now we're completely the other way. But it's been a very interesting conversation. The frustration, I'm sure, by employers is great. waiting for new rules and regs. The only thing we keep saying, you can't be doing the testing right now and you can't be asking the questions unless you're law enforcement, and a different set of rules apply.
And military.
And military. And if the feds decide to make marijuana legal, boy, we've got so much going on. I think the takeaway, though, is you must stay informed. If you've got a question, ask somebody. And if you've got some more questions, you can always go to info@commercialinvestigationsllc.com for more information. I want to thank our wonderful panel today, Michelle Pyan, Joan Marie Dowling, Sheriff Juan Figueroa. Thank you so very much. And if we get caught speeding in his county, what do you think? That's right. Thank you all. Really enlightening, still frustrating, but very enlightening. Thank you. Thank you all for spending time with us.